topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello, and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Bahia Yaksan. I am a core alignment coach and a diversity educator. If you're interested in seeing courses I offer to folks, you can check out my website. It's called knowwhatyouvantcoaching.wordpress.com. And I basically support organizations or individuals who are trying to align their actions with their values. And I love this podcast because you never know what we're going to be talking about. And today we have a guest who is a U.S. 8th grade American history teacher. And I've been so eager to talk to someone who actually teaches American history right now in these times. I'm really grateful. And let me do a proper introduction. Victor Lagunes, I'm so grateful, is here today. He's a teacher in the Sacramento area, where he's taught U.S. history for the last 13 years at Da Vinci Junior High, which is a project-based learning school. In addition to his teaching duties, he has served in leadership of his local teachers union and on various school-related political campaigns, and he's deeply involved with community issues through nonprofit work. Victor, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Absolutely, Bahia. Thanks so much for having me. Excited for it.
Great. So you can give us a perspective of what is it like to teach American history themes? And again, you can just talk about that, but like in these unprecedented times when there's some things happening, and as far as I understand, have not really aren't thematic, but let me listen to you.
Yeah, I think it's such a big question, and we can start to kind of peel it back in a variety of ways. And I think the place to start with is where we're at now, and maybe some of the conscious decisions that I've made rather than ones that have just kind of organically come about with teaching as it's evolved after we went through, I'm going to use the word unprecedented, which is going to come up, but the unprecedented times of the pandemic, which really impacted public education on the whole. And then, maybe later what will happen is we'll recognize some of the differences from, the pre-pandemic times and some of those shifts. I think that where it is now is a point where our students and us as people, I think sometimes that's not a part that's acknowledged, are just bombarded with information at just, I think, really alarming rates. And we don't get to process all of that. And I think one of the conscious decisions I've made is to not try and tackle every single news-related kind of, not to call it clickbait, because these are, current events. They're issues that are coming up, but the pace at which they move is really difficult to process with students. And I think the challenge goes a little bit further when you're talking about junior high students. So I teach 8th grade, which is predominantly 13 and 14-year-olds. And there are moments where they truly do engage with an issue when it arises. And sometimes that's just from a tangential comment that someone makes, and we go down that road and explore it, try and find reliable and credible resources for it, so that the conversation is geared around what is factual, but also sometimes they're planned and they're related to the content that we're studying at that time. And I think that being able to recognize that we're not going to be able to talk about all those, especially since we have our own content that we have to get through, throughout the year through standards and things like that. But also, when is the appropriate time, and how much bandwidth do they have for all of these issues, and the depth that you have to go through for each one to really understand it. And I think there's a value to just being aware of things that are happening in the world, but being conscious about how often you spend talking about some of these news stories and what they are and what they mean. And I think maybe the sad part is that the amount of bombardment that they have in particular, that's not just about news related, but information in general, leads them to, I think, have fewer questions and potentially, I think also in the current climate that we're in, be worried to say or think the wrong things. And I would say the wrong things in quotes, rather than, making a judgment on them. And it's clear that our society, that, discourse is something that has continually eroded over time. And I think that they feel that and are hesitant to engage in it in the same way, for fear of, what may come in terms of just like, are they going to turn into, rather than, talking about ideas, are we going to be talking about personal attacks? Are they going to feel prepared or that they have enough credible information to engage in it and confident with that? So I think there's a hesitancy to take the time to think about things and also want to engage with them more than what I've seen in previous years.
Wow. That's interesting. And that's sad. That the hesitation, I mean, and I know you respond to them, to their developmental age, and I'm very glad. I'm very glad you don't bombard developing teenagers with all the stuff we're bombarded with. I appreciate that. But wow, that's just, I'm just sitting with what you said about how they are, because of the overall societal lack of civil communication among adults in the country, that it's this developing 13, 14-year-olds are picking up on the hesitancy and afraid to, if I'm understanding you correctly, afraid to take a stance.
Yeah,
Fear-
that's definitely it. That's what I meant to portray. And I mean, I can't say that with a certainty, right? I have a limited scope of what I'm seeing with youth, the number of classes that I teach and the area that I teach in. These are all going to be things that impact that. And I also think that it depends on what you're talking about. Some of these are going to feel a lot more charged than others, topics that are going on around the world. And I think that those come with their own, I think, like contextual needs whenever you bring those up. So, for example, if we're talking about, the acts of violence that take place, let's say locally, here in the United States, there is the history that it takes to understand that is vastly different than, say, talking about the variety of conflicts, wars, genocides, reactions that have taken place in other parts of the globe that are either currently happening or have happened in, more recent history, because I've been teaching for the last 13 years. So there's been a few to be able to discuss. And those require so much more. And so, one of the assignments that we used to do with regularity, when I taught ninth grade, which was world geography class, was current events. And I think that you can see the development in students, which it should be obvious to many, but it's pretty stark. And I think what was really exciting about teaching ninth graders was the level at which they had to pay attention to the world outside them and to think about things a little bit more, not just maturity, but maybe some patience and some agency towards really delving into things, meaning that they're willing to take the time to do the background and those sorts of things. But I'm comparing these different issues, and they require a whole lot of different sets of information to contextualize. And but at the core, regardless, one is local, the other ones are like international. Local maybe is not the word, right? National within our country, and others are international. But I think still would require an immense amount to unpack. And then not everyone, if you want to talk about things that are much more local at their age, are not quite engaging for them. I think that there's a critical point at which they start being aware of the immediate surroundings, and that I think has some delays because of the technology. And so much of the world is what is part of the digital boundaries, right? Rather than national or international ones or local ones, it's just about what corners of the internet you're on versus the geographic region.
Oh, digital boundaries. That's a good
Yeah.
term. I'm going to write that down. Good one.
I really think that I did just make that one up. I haven't read that one or had anybody really talk about it, but I just think it's about considering the world that so much of our youth is in, and I really do think that it doesn't have the same limitations that had for even people that are only slightly older than them, let alone those that are part of generations past. I believe that the world in which information came to you from was much more geographically tied, and or like we talked about at the just in the first part of my response, not the frequency with which that information was being given to you.
Well, I'm curious. Well, thinking about national events, I'm actually I'm thinking of like a violence that's occurring nationally, but also what I consider occurring. I feel like the whole new unprecedented use of ICE agents, and I'm also thinking of people getting together to object to such activities that are, in my understanding of U.S. history, unprecedented, at least in the last 100 years. I don't know. Just the people being grabbed off the street by masked people with no badges and no identification, not being told why they're being grabbed. That's, I don't know if that's entering, if you're seeing that with 8th graders, and if you do, like, how do you help them, I don't know, comprehend, put into context, not feel threatened, if that's even possible?
Mm-hmm. I think that this maybe is a little tongue in cheek, but I'm fortunate that not many of them are tracking maybe some of the more complex issues. Like I said, to be able to discuss them require a lot of contextualization because they don't have that. And so I think they hear words, that they don't quite understand because they don't have the background to be able to do it. I would say that even in my scope as a U.S. history teacher, I wouldn't say that I would be able to speak to every instance in which executive power has been abused in order to limit the rights of individuals. There are your famous examples, Executive Order 9066 from the World War II era, where we interned Japanese American people. That is a use of executive power done under the guise of national security that, we have definitely had to come to terms with in terms of the history of the United States, the harm that was done to families, the generational opportunities that were limited or cut short because of those actions. So we have seen instances of it in the past, but those are pieces of content. Like I have that one, but that example alone is an entire set of lessons for high schoolers to unpack, let alone to discuss as an example of executive power being used on peoples within the United States. And so I think that when I said that I'm fortunate maybe that they're not tracking all these things, it's not that I don't wish to be able to explore these with them and to help them think critically, evaluate their own sources and formulate their own opinions about these things. It's that I think that it may be requiring a little bit more than what we have the bandwidth to do when we also have the other curriculums that we study. And so I think what tends to be more impactful is when things align with what we see within the history content that we cover, because then there is an inroad to be able to provide examples of how there are themes in history that do repeat themselves, and whether they're identical or not, being able to compare and contrast what those look like and the impacts that they have, both on the people at the time, but sustained ones over time as well.
What are some themes that are aligning now?
I think, sadly, I think that we really are in a time period where it's hard to find a lot of inroads to some of these. I think that partly because of the historical record and the level of detail that we get into within 8th grade history, to be able to go down the road of looking at, let's say, tensions between political parties and ideology throughout U.S. history. Sure, we can talk about, anti-federalists, in early U.S. history, but does that mean that we'll be able to comment on how their perspectives differed from others and how that led to tensions and conflict, but interpersonal conflicts, even amongst people that were pretty similarly driven or passionate about the governance of the United States? I think there's maybe some, but they would be pretty weak, because where they would break down is in the issues of the time. The Constitution was written when firearms were something that you would had to be a well-trained soldier to fire 3 rounds in 1 minute, and now we have firearms that do unthinkable more damage than what they had. There is nothing in the Constitution that discusses technologies that we have today. I mean, I mentioned the internet, but that's leaps and bounds beyond even what they considered for the time. We were talking about a time with no trains. So there's really the issues that are being discussed. But then I think what's worse is that nowadays, so much of it is beyond the issues and is being politicized. So literally making gains in political arguments rather than solutions for the issues at hand that impact the people. And so I think, I laughed out of a nervousness almost, because I think that there are a lot of things that we're seeing now in terms of the divide that is going on politically that don't allow for compromise between people of different ideologies around governance. That does seem to be at a point that has not happened previously. And could it be that somebody could tell me that the Whig Party had its own divisions, which caused factions and these sorts of discussions? It's possible, but I think that the connections with the history content that we cover at the depth that we cover don't provide a whole lot of that, at the 8th grade level. And that does make it difficult. And I think that also does make it interesting and an opportunity for us to think about, how did we get here? How are we still here? And what are the things that have to be done in order to really make progress and move forward?
To really make progress and move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, something came to mind when you talked about current. I guess I'm just thinking out loud about what came to mind is the current Speaker of the House keeping Congress out, like not bringing them back when we have the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. As an American citizen, it just seems outrageous. Like, wait a minute, like, don't we want to move forward? Don't we? How do we find? And I heard James Clyburn, the representative from North Carolina, last night talking about it's really difficult to talk to people with different ideologies when we are not called together by the House of, the Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
And I just thought, wow, yeah, good point. So that seems, I don't know if that's ever happened before, but whether it has or not, that kind of leads me to a question for you about the Constitution, which I apologize, I have not fully reread. I've actually been looking at it lately because I'm like, wait a minute, all these, that's unprecedented? Is that
Mhm.
illegal? Is that legal? I actually literally would like all of America to have a U.S. 8th grade history class again, just civics class. Um, but back to the Constitution, just thinking about like the no kings day. Can't
Mhm.
help, that reminds me of the American Revolution. I know we don't have a all powerful king who's the president of the United States. I know it's not exactly analogous, and yet I also looked at numbers like that have grown. Like in April, there was a march protesting the way the current administration is making some unprecedented moves that are not constitutionally, um, that are not in the
They're
Constitution.
questionable. Yeah. Yeah.
It's questionable. 3 million, and then in June 5 million, and then I heard this recent one was 7 million people. So more and more and more people are apparently feeling like, wow, more and more power is being taken away, less and less attention following the U.S. Constitution. And I don't know. That's a big question I'm handing over to you, but like,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the opener was what had its own things to peel back, and we've just delved like deeper and deeper into one.
sorry, that's
No,
me.
I think it's great. It's there's a lot of ways that I could start talking about this. I think that it is great to see that people are engaged and that they know that they have a First Amendment right to petition the government and to come together to do so, and that continues to grow because they continue to have concerns about how the government is run. And I think that maybe ironically, the whole idea of the no king, the titling of it, really does bring it back to a time which is the origins, the impetus of our own nation, but how different that time was to what we have now. At the time, the people that were arguing that we should not have a king and pay taxes were mostly elite, college educated, land owning white men with privilege. And it was not a representation of everyone that was in the colonies, those that were marginalized or not. And so the idea that now this is coming full circle to say that, the government that we created was in order to remove absolute power from a single individual is so interesting, because it is true that was the goal of it, and in many ways it was a success and is because of the living nature of our Constitution. But the context of it is vastly different, and it harkens back to a time that was so different in terms of who did have rights and had the ability to to participate in that discussion and make that decision. I can recall that there are documents where say that the taxes being imposed by King George III were akin to slavery at a time when slavery existed and there were enslaved people that were having their own rights and humanity and dignity taken from them. So it is the name alone is I think just I hate the word interesting. It's such a way to like just kind of throw out, oh, this is something to think about. But the difference between when that idea of not having a king in the United States originated and where we're at now are so different. Um, I think that, to get back to your question though, in terms of the Constitution and reading it, I think the challenge is that there are some things that are being done by our current administration that directly relate to the letter of what's in the Constitution. So President Trump indicated his willingness to try and get rid of birthright citizenship, which is granted in the Constitution. And so I think that, like that one, there are students at the end of my 8th grade year of U.S. history who could point to the Constitution and say that's where that is a violation of our founding document, or one of its amendments, I should say. But there are so many others that require a knowledge of precedents, both legal and actionable. So judicial precedents in terms of things that have seen court cases or actions that have been taken by Congress or the executive branch previously. There are procedural rules that don't show up in the Constitution that Congress operates under, which I think they become a little bit insider in terms of who has access to them and who can leverage them to their benefit.
Right.
And I think the knowledge of all those things is not something that the lay person, even somebody that's well read, will have the time to truly understand from the outside without being involved day to day. And in those instances, I think this is where we really have to trust in the institutions that we create in our democracy, and ones that we have created over time and that we still continue to have. Because if you look at the places where democracy fails, it is a lack of trust in the social contract that's created in terms of a formation of a government that's by its people and participation of its people, a democracy. And when you lose that trust, whether it be in the actual institutions, in the processes they use, such as elections, then it starts to tear down the willingness the ability for it to be in check. And so I do think that court systems play an extremely vital role, and our ability, or our what we can do is use our ability to find information that is reliable and accurate, that has integrity, I think, behind the information that it's putting out there, and attempt to be informed and understand the content that we're reading and think critically about that in order to truly, understand whether things are or aren't. And I think that is a critical piece that we have to be able to have, because nobody, and I say that, with a little bit of hyperbole, but nobody's going to have the time to really understand all the ins and outs of all the things that are going on. And the reality is that that's why so many people become disengaged, even with local issues. If I just want to talk about the community I live in and city issues, the number of people that are disengaged because there's so much to process in terms of the history for just one town or city, and you put that at the national scale, and you really get people that are disengaged, or if they are engaged, it's around the politicized nature of the world that we're living in the United States right now.
Wow. Before we go to local issues, I actually thank you for reminding me that we do need more than an 8th grade history education to intelligently understand the Constitution.
I mean,
so thanks for that.
Yeah,
True.
not to interrupt you if you're leading into another question, but I do think on that point, what is maybe a greater irony is that we have a test to become citizens of this nation. So my parents are both immigrants, they tested, and there have been numerous attempts at understanding where civics education is in this country. And you can look at a variety of these sources, but overall, it looks pretty grim in terms of what so many citizens of the United States know about their own country and civics, and whether they would be able to pass the tests that we hold to immigrants that come to this country and want to become citizens and start a life here. And that part is, has been something that I remember my student teaching years. I taught seniors, and we gave them as part of their curriculum, we gave them the test that is required of immigrants to this country, because that should be a bar that we all hold ourselves to. Not necessarily, I'm not saying the government should, but shouldn't we as citizens hold ourselves to that?
I really appreciate that, because my father was also an immigrant, and he knew more about American history, the Constitution than so many of us who grew up here, including myself. So I really, really, that should be a bar, and I really appreciate that. And one more thing I want to kind of underscore that you said that helped me think more clearly about trying to interpret the Constitution, which again, it depends. Even if I were an attorney, or there's like strict interpretations, like when you mentioned the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, or that it's so different now. And if I there's just so many different ways to interpret it. So again, I really don't think our founding fathers would have thought it was, I should be able to go have a semi-automatic and take it on the streets, but I won't belabor that anymore. But I wanted to ask you if is this a good time to talk about a local issue?
Sure, let's do that.
I was just thinking about people who work really hard. Like you said, it takes time to understand issues. Even one local proposal we have in California, Prop 50, it's really kind of painful to see how much thinking it takes and time it takes and communication. It's effort and thinking and patience to help understand, like get my own clarity, do my own research, and then see what other people are thinking. And then I'm just going to say one true example is that some people who are just working really hard doing physical labor jobs have heard Prop 50 in California doesn't sound fair because it's gerrymandering and redistricting, and didn't we settle that years ago, and why are we doing that now? And it's like, good question, but it takes time to contextualize. It's in response to something else that's happening nationally to try to actually reach temporarily change the redistricting so that we could be perhaps more equitable, which is kind of ironic. I don't know. You explain it better than I can.
I mean, I think that I would hesitate to think that I can explain it better, but I think there's so much to think about in terms of the reasons people do or don't engage. And I believe that, from my perspective as a teacher, I'll start there. Where we see it is there is a bandwidth that people have in terms of what time they have available and attention they have available and the impact that they see on them. And so, you mentioned like people that are working day to day, and, the ability for them to attend to some of these issues and to think, is this something that does impact me? And then to be able to understand the background of all of these and the motives for why these propositions crop up. Freudian slip there. But they do get propped up. They get propped up by individuals that are either for or against them. And what are the origins of those arguments? What are the motives of those arguments? And I really do feel for the amount of people that, their goal right now is survival first, right? Absolutely. It's about work. It's about raising a family if they have one, or taking care of family members. It's about being able to work enough to pay for the variety of things in the United States that are rising in cost at really high rates. When we talk about simple things like groceries, when we talk about pretty obvious and now longstanding debates around healthcare. So I start with a little bit of patience and understanding for people that don't feel that they have the time or the ability to truly understand issues. And so, rather than villainize, I think it's empower and say, like, it can be easy. You can go and find the resources necessary. And especially as long as we maintain easily accessible, free, I say free, they are free, but what I mean is without limitations, elections without limitations, without barriers to people's participation, then you can see an increase in those things and people attending to them. I think that for, there's a couple other things in your question or prompt that you gave me to talk about. And so, we start with, why are some people disengaged? Okay, that's maybe a starting point about where they're at in their lives and what time do they have to participate in this. But then, it's about each issue as well. and each issue can be vastly different and have people react differently. I think you brought up Prop 50, which is here in California, our proposition that's on the ballot about districting and gerrymandering. And I think that there are concerns around, is it something that looks like it's fair? And because the word gerrymandering inherently means that it is unfair, you can look at the most basic pictures and you can draw districts to have, significant minorities have more voice in representative governments. But it requires so much more of a discussion beyond that, which is a national one. It's a state-based issue, but the reaction and the reason that it's on the ballot is a response to a national push to try and skew congressional representation as well. And I think that many people are at the point now where they're frustrated by our national government and legislature, in that we have a few set of clear-cut issues that a majority of Americans are on a side of restructuring and changing. Namely, the top three are common sense gun reform, reproductive rights, and healthcare. And these are all polling in 60s and over in terms of favorability to change, and Congress has done nothing for that. And I don't just mean under the current administration, right? I am talking about for a long-standing time, and that frustration builds, and it manifests in different ways. And so I think that, but what that means also is that people are even more sensitive to if there are going to be seats lost in that Congress, because they know the power of having a majority in a world when the two dominant political parties don't interact, do not compromise, do not work together in order to solve problems for the everyday American. And so I think that that you're looking at that with Prop 50, and then the propositions that are on ballots in many states across the United States that are dealing with districting in a response to that. And I think maybe getting back to the No Kings rally, in response to the threat of a president who we have seen take action to try and overthrow the results of an election, and a fear that could be something that happened again. And how much easier would it be if more of Congress was continuing to be part of the same political party that has been willing to back those sorts of ideas? And so I think that if you start to understand all of those things, it becomes clear as to why this is on the ballot, even though this seems to be something that we should all be against, right? Is temporarily giving up control, the independent commission control of gerrymandering or redistricting, and pseudo gerrymandering them, is something that many people are like, well, why we came up with a solution for this. It seems to be working. And the realities is that the ability to influence the outcome of elections through the drawing lines is something that has existed in our country for a long time. When we talk about the redlining of people in terms of housing and where they lived and how those lines were drawn, and that doesn't excuse it, but I think it does provide context for what is the thing that you're upset about, right? If you think that this is unfair, because if you think this one thing is unfair, can we look at the number of other things that are happening as well, and then begin to weigh where are our priorities, and where do we prioritize the things that we need to get done now in order to have our government work for the people?
Well put. And it helped also when you pointed out, like, this is a state proposal, but it's in the context against a national push to actually redistrict in a much more profoundly unfair way.
Yeah, correct. And I think that it cannot be understated, the ability to for people to be able to access voting, like to be able to go vote, to participate in their own democracy, is limited in so many places. And I mean, if you want to have a true democracy, you should be making that easily accessible, and doing more to provide availability for that. And mail-in ballots have done a great job of that. And I think that the potential for having A national holiday for certain elections would be a really great way to be able to provide more access for working people who are paid by the hour and taking time off, if that's a limitation for them, easing that up. I mentioned mail-in ballots, but the other thing that we know is that when I talked about trust in institutions earlier in the podcast, I think that one of the things we've seen is that there is a credibility around elections that has continually been attacked, and in it mostly in the recent 10 years. And I, in the last instance where I was doing some volunteer work, doing some canvassing, I had a few people speak to me about how in the local television it said that mail-in ballots are not counted, and that that it is a wasted vote, and that you won't have your say if you do a mail-in. And that is an extremely dangerous narrative to put out there. And this is how democracies crumble, because people they fail because people don't hold that trust in their institutions and the value of voting. And that provides more weight for people that do vote because they know that it is not that way. So there's so many layers to these sorts of things. And, I want to circle back to the beginning part. I understand why it's overwhelming for people. But I do think that if you can have meaningful discourse, if you can have calm and, I think focused on ideas rather than people, then what you can do is uncover these things and think through the facts together, and then be able to come to the conclusions that you want without needing it to be about whether or not you agree means whether or not you can continue to interact with that person. And I always talk about whether you agree or not, you should be able to sit down and finish that cup of coffee, whatever that moment is. And I think that's the critical piece that we're missing nowadays. And it does take time. It takes effort. It's not easy. It is not easy.
No. Wow. Okay. I'm trying to decide. I think I have 3 more questions.
I
We
mean,
have 9 more.
I'm like free form answering here. I feel like it's there's a stream of consciousness that I'm going down, and it helps when you give me these loose prompts, but it's also maybe I'm not as focused as you want me to be.
Oh no, this new questions. And I think we have about 8.5, 9 minutes, so I think we can do this.
Okay.
And then go back to like what you're pointing to is how to move forward. That's I was like to always end on that note, reminding us what we can do. But before we get there, hopefully this is just constructive thinking out loud. When you talked about having faith in institutions, I just feel like I've been watching, like you mentioned, the last 10 years. There's, and think particular on some subjects, you can talk about, like, what is that phrase, bothism or both sidesism. But in the last 10 years, I've kind of had to admit to myself, no, wait, actually, there's clearly, and believe me, there are a lot of people in my family that I know and love who are on the right, so to speak, on the right. So I don't say this with hate, but clearly I just feel like there's been a creeping cumulative effect from the right, trying to sowing seeds of doubt in the institutions,
Sure.
and doubt in the government. And for quite some time, I was like, actually, no, this democracy is unique. It's amazing. America has a lot of flaws. I do think we're becoming a more perfect union. I'm not giving up on our government. No, I believe in this democracy. I'm going to keep using my rights and hopefully power to also benefit others who don't have as much as I have. But in the last, since the current president was reelected, in the last few months, I found myself feeling like, oh my gosh, the Supreme Court is like not acting very objectively. It seems like they're truly favoring. I don't see an objectivity that I saw before, or like again to pick on the Speaker of the House, like, why is he not installed Representative Arizona, who was elected and her election was certified, but it's been 4 weeks, and the people who voted for are not, she's not able to represent them yet. So I started realizing, oh my gosh, am I starting to doubt the institutions? And then it's like, no, no, I don't doubt the institutions. It's the current people in those positions of power that I feel like are abusing power and
Yeah,
not really paying attention to what the 7 million people plus who are saying, hey, you know what? We want those things that you mentioned. Healthcare. We don't want healthcare subsidies taken away. And I forgot which, thousands of people could die literally in 1 year if those things are taken away. So,
uh, I think you bring up a good point, which is the institutions are different than the people that run them. I
mhm,
think I said that a trust in a court system, and then you bring up the obvious questions around the Supreme Court and its leanings, and compared to the maybe recent history, let's say. But it's also the manner in which they're appointed is by Senate commissions, which are elected by people, which are a representation mostly of, the current viewpoints nationally. Or you would hope, at least. But I do think that, to your point, you can dismantle those things. And that's the dangerous thing. It's not just our own faith in them, but how well they're preserved.
mhm,
So if there are dissenting opinions of people within our government and they get fired from positions because they were not in line with the current administration, that is a dismantling of our institutions,
mhm,
right? And that is going to harm our republic. And I think that's part of it, is absolutely, is like you said, it's the people that participate in it. There was another point that you made, though, I think that kind of comes up, which is, when we're talking about the court seemingly leaning in a way, I think that you there are a lot of parts of our government that have never been revised either.
mhm,
2-year terms for House of Representative members, lifelong terms for peoples that sit on the Supreme Court. And those discussions won't go anywhere, unfortunately. There won't ever be easy times to do those because of the politicized nature of where we're at. People will want to make wins in those. And I think those are things that, if we were in a healthier state, we'd be willing to think, does the government do what it's supposed to do in terms of representing people and the needs of them? And would it be better if it could be modified in small ways, over time? But you have to be able to address that with a certain amount of selflessness that we don't see from many politicians, especially at the national level or even at state levels sometimes. I would say that any level can have people that don't approach it with some selflessness, right? They serve the people. It is a public service to be there, and that's the way that it should be approached, in my opinion. I think that there was one other thought that like really resonated with me when you were talking about that. And it when you were talking about people starting to question and doubt elections, because I mentioned the last 10 years.
mhm,
And I think, sadly, the thing is, though, is that there have always been people that have felt that it is rigged against them.
mhm,
I would, like I am not somebody that has experienced what it is to be Black in America, but I know from history that there have been there's uncountable number of instances in which people feel like they are not represented as part of the dominant narrative.
mhm,
And whether things feel bought and paid for from that perspective is not something new. The question is are they question that is there a doubt of the integrity of the system to begin with, right? Whether the rules are fair or not in terms of who can participate and how it's done. Political parties have their own rules and their own agendas in politics as well, which is super fascinating. Excuse me. And so there's always room for people to have doubts about the legitimacy of how things come out compared to whether that was based on like merit, let's say merit. But I do think that the dangerous point that we're in is things that we know quantifiably are sound, such as the security of voting and voting by mail
mhm,
and the ability to count those accurately.
mhm.
When you start to question those things and sow that doubt, that's where we have some real danger.
Great distinction. Wow, thank you. Well, So we do have like a minute and a half. So I watched the documentary on Andrew Young that is just really excellent and encouraging. And when I heard him say, who was the assistant to Martin Luther King, had accomplished so many things through so many fights. At the end of the documentary, he's still alive. I think he's 96. He said he has hope. And that, you know, there's a recurring theme of protests that eventually can end up affecting laws and creating a more perfect union. And I'll turn it over to you, Victor. What's your closing thought?
I think, you know, since you're quoting somebody that worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I think it's easy to just, you know, put out the most memorable quote, which is the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think as long as people continue to stay engaged and fight for what they believe is right and do so in ways that don't harm others and stay informed and think critically based on fact, it will continue to do so.
Thank you so much. It's great having you here today. I also want to thank our viewers and listeners, our engineer Rebel, our producer Dean, and please tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Talk 4 TV, or it's w4cy.com. And thank you, Victor Lagunes. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. It was a real pleasure. Appreciate it.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech